Loretta Vane had spent 79 years believing that if you loved your family without condition, if you gave them everything you had without ever keeping score, they would be there standing beside you when the world turned cold. Instead, on a gray Tuesday morning in October, she received an eviction notice carried not by a stranger, but by her own oldest son, delivered with the flat efficiency of someone completing a task on a to-do list. Widowed, left with nothing but a single suitcase her children had begrudgingly allowed her to pack, and the faint memory of something her grandmother Harriet had whispered on her deathbed 50 years ago. A promise about a Bible, about something hidden inside it, about a truth that would save her on her darkest day. Loretta Vane walked away from the only home she had known for 27 years, toward a crumbling property nobody in the family had thought about in decades, completely unaware that what she was about to find inside that old Bible would not only reclaim everything that had been taken from her, but would force the powerful people responsible to answer publicly for every single thing they had done. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Loretta stood on the cracked concrete driveway of 14, Willowmere Drive, Hargrave Falls, Georgia, and watched her youngest son, Alton, direct two hired movers through the front door she had painted herself 12 years ago. A deep hunter green she had chosen because Franklin had loved that color, had said it reminded him of the Georgia pines they used to walk through when they were young and had nothing but each other and thought that was plenty. The movers were carrying her things out with the casual indifference of people handling furniture rather than the accumulated evidence of a human life. A ceramic lamp she and Franklin had bought on their 30th anniversary trip to Savannah. A quilt her mother had hand-stitched over the course of an entire winter. Boxes of photographs. 40 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had meant everything to her and apparently nothing at all to the three people overseeing their removal. "Mom, the new tenants need the keys by noon," said Brendan, her oldest, without looking up from his phone. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered and prosperous in the easy way of men who had always had someone else absorbing the difficult parts of their lives. He spoke to her the way he spoke to his firm's administrative staff, politely enough, but with the underlying implication that her feelings were a logistical inconvenience rather than a human reality. "If you need a minute, take it now. But we really do need to keep things moving." Loretta said nothing. She had been saying nothing for 3 months, ever since the conversation, if it could be called that, in which all three of her children had sat across from her at Curran's kitchen table and explained, with the rehearsed calm of people who had agreed on their talking points in advance, that the rental property she had lived in since Franklin died was being sold by the owner's estate, and that they had collectively decided it was the right time for her to transition into a managed care facility. Transition. That was the word Corinne had used, her 49-year-old daughter, who worked in corporate communications and had a talent for making terrible things sound administrative. Not move, not leave your home, but transition, as though Loretta were a company quietly restructuring its assets rather than a 79-year-old widow being told that the life she had carefully built was being folded up and put away. She had argued, of course, had reminded them that she was perfectly capable of managing on her own, that she cooked and cleaned and walked 2 miles every morning without fail and had never missed a single doctor's appointment in the past decade. Had reminded them, though she hated having to say it aloud, that she had given 30 years of her life entirely to raising them, had worked double shifts as a seamstress for nearly a decade after Franklin's small carpentry business struggled, had gone without new clothing for 4 straight years so that Brendan could finish his law degree without carrying $1 of student debt. None of it had mattered. They had already made the decision before sitting down at that table. The conversation had not been a discussion, but a notification, carefully delivered with just enough surface warmth to allow them to feel they had handled it with decency. Loretta had applied to every senior housing facility within 40 miles, exactly as they had suggested. Every single one had a waiting list of at least 8 months. She had told them this plainly, had shown them the letters, had laid out the facts with the patience of someone who still believed evidence could change minds. Their response had been a shrug collectively and say something would come up, that she needed to be more flexible, that perhaps she was being unnecessarily particular about her limited options. And then October had arrived. The new tenants were coming tomorrow morning. And here she stood watching strangers carry away her ceramic lamp and her mother's quilt. "I have somewhere to go," Loretta said quietly. All three of them looked at her for the first time that morning, which told her everything she needed to know about how closely they had been watching her during the preceding hours. "Grandma Harriet's old land," she continued, keeping her voice steady and deliberate. "The main house has been gone for years, but the stone structure behind it is still standing. I'll stay there while I sort things out." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence, and then Alton, her youngest, 46 years old, who had inherited Franklin's eyes and absolutely none of his character, let out a short laugh. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive in the particular way that is somehow worse than open cruelty. "Mom, that place hasn't been touched in 30 years. There's no power, no water. You can't possibly." "I'm not asking your permission," Loretta said simply and without heat. "I'm telling you where I'll be, in the unlikely event that any of you find yourselves wondering." She picked up her suitcase, the single bag they had allowed her to fill from an entire household of possessions, and began walking down Willowmere Drive without looking back. Behind her, she heard Brendan say something low and certain to his siblings, his voice carrying the comfortable authority of a man who had never once been genuinely wrong about anything and didn't intend to start now. Something about giving her a few days before she came around to being reasonable about a facility placement. Loretta kept walking, and as she walked, through the quiet Georgia morning with its smell of pine and coming rain, a memory she had not allowed herself to touch in 50 years began rising slowly and deliberately to the surface. Her grandmother Harriet's voice, thin and urgent in the dim light of a hospital room, pressing something small and cold into Loretta's palm with a grip that was surprisingly fierce for a woman that close to the end. "When everything is gone," Harriet had whispered, her eyes clear and absolutely serious despite everything, "go to the Bible. The real one. The old one that nobody ever opened because they thought it was just decoration. I put something inside it for you a long time ago. Something that will matter more than you can possibly imagine on the day you need it most. Promise me you'll remember, Loretta, no matter how long it takes. Promise me." Loretta had promised, holding her grandmother's hand and privately believing it was the fading confusion of a woman losing her hold on the world. She was 79 years old now. She had nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose. And she was finally, after half a century, going to find out what Harriet Cowell had meant. Harriet Cowell's property sat 7 miles outside of Hargrave Falls, down a narrow road that the county had stopped maintaining sometime in the early 90s, and that nature had been quietly reclaiming ever since. Loretta had not been there in 31 years. The last time she had visited, Franklin had been driving, and Harriet had still been alive, still living in the main house with her vegetable garden and her 2 cats, and her absolute refusal to apologize for anything she had ever done or believed. The house had burned down in 2003, an electrical fault in the walls that nobody had caught in time. By then, Harriet was already gone, and the land had passed into a family trust that collected its minimal property taxes every year and otherwise treated the acreage as a forgotten line in a legal document. The walk was long, and Loretta's suitcase was heavier than she had anticipated. She stopped twice to rest, sitting on her case at the roadside with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the tree line, breathing steadily and refusing to cry. She had made herself a promise on the driveway of 14, Willowmere Drive, that she would not spend her tears on people who had demonstrated so clearly that they did not deserve them. She intended to keep that promise. By the time the old property came into view, the October light had shifted from morning gray into a thin, pale gold that filtered through the pines and lay across the overgrown clearing in long, quiet strips. Where the main house had stood, there was nothing now but a low concrete foundation almost entirely consumed by weeds and the determined roots of a young oak that had found purchase in a crack sometime in the past decade and had simply kept growing, indifferent to whatever human plans had once occupied that ground. But the stone structure was still there. It stood at the far edge of the clearing, built against the natural rise of the land, half hidden by decades of unchecked ivy and the sprawling lower branches of two old sweet gum trees. It was smaller than Loretta remembered, but then everything from deep memory had a way of shrinking when reality finally caught up to it. A low building of mortared fieldstone with a heavy wooden door set into its face, weathered silver gray with age, but fundamentally intact. Harriet had used it as a storage room primarily, canned preserves, garden tools, the overflow of a life lived practically and without waste. But she had also used it as a thinking space, a place to sit quietly with her Bible and her thoughts when the demands of family life pressed too heavily on her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door was secured with a padlock coated in decades of rust. So thoroughly oxidized, it looked almost ornamental. Loretta set down her suitcase and reached into the interior pocket of her coat, her fingers finding what they had been carrying for 50 years without her ever fully understanding why she had kept it. A small brass key on a tarnished chain, pressed in her palm by Harriet in that hospital room, its meaning deferred for half a century until this gray October morning when it finally, irrevocably, became necessary. The key resisted at first. Loretta worked it carefully, using both hands, applying steady pressure the way she had learned to handle stubborn things over 79 years, not with force, but with patient, deliberate insistence. The lock gave with a grinding reluctance that seemed almost theatrical, as though the decades themselves were protesting the disturbance. The door was worse, swollen with moisture and warped by countless cycles of Georgia heat and winter cold. It had settled firmly into its frame and had no particular interest in moving. Loretta planted her feet, wrapped both hands around the iron handle, and pulled with everything she had. The door resisted for a long moment, and then gave suddenly, swinging outward with a low groan that sent a pair of startled birds rocketing out of the sweet gum branches overhead. A breath of cool, earthy air moved past her, the smell of old stone and dry wood and something else underneath it, faint but unmistakable. Lavender, Harriet's scent, the sachets she had kept in every drawer and cabinet and corner of her life, apparently surviving even 30 years of abandonment in trace amounts, as though the old woman had simply refused to dissipate entirely. Loretta stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The interior was dim and cluttered with the ghosts of a practical life. Empty wooden shelves along the walls, a few ancient mason jars filmed with dust, a rusted garden fork leaning in the corner. But against the far wall, sitting exactly where Loretta somehow knew it would be despite not having seen it in 3 decades, was Harriet's reading chair. Low-backed, oak-framed, the cushion long since rotted away to nothing, but the frame still solid. And on the small side table beside it, placed with the deliberate care of someone who had arranged it precisely and intentionally, was the Bible. Not the decorative one from the mantelpiece that the family had always admired and never opened. Not the newer one Harriet had used for daily reading. This was the old one. Ancient, thick, its black cover cracked and worn to a deep charcoal gray, its gilt lettering almost entirely faded. The one Harriet had brought with her from her own mother's house in rural Alabama in 1951. The one nobody in the family had ever thought to look inside, because it had always sat on display like an artifact rather than a living object. It was sitting there waiting. It had been waiting for 31 years. Loretta crossed the room, sat down carefully on the edge of the old chair frame, and reached for the Bible with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere between the padlock and the door, steadied by something she could not quite name, but recognized as the particular calm that arrives when a person is finally, after a very long time, arrived exactly where they were always meant to be. The Bible was heavier than she expected. Loretta lifted it from the side table with both hands, feeling the solid weight of it settle into her palms, the cracked leather cover rough against her fingers. She held it for a long moment without opening it, the way you hold something precious before you allow yourself to fully believe it is real. Outside, the wind moved through the sweet gum trees with a low, steady sound, and the thin October light continued its patient work through the gaps in the old stone walls, laying pale strips across the dusty floor. Loretta had spent 50 years not thinking about this moment. That was not entirely accurate. She had thought about it occasionally, in the distracted way you think about dreams that have mostly faded, the details uncertain, the emotional weight somehow still intact despite the lost clarity. Harriet's voice in the hospital room, the fierce grip of a dying woman's hand, the small brass key pressed in her palm with an urgency that had seemed disproportionate at the time, even slightly alarming, the kind of intensity that the very old sometimes directed toward things the young could not yet understand. She had tucked the key away in a jewelry box when she got home from the hospital that evening and had not touched it intentionally for years. Then Franklin had found it one afternoon while looking for a cuff link, had held it up with a questioning look, and she had told him the story. He had listened carefully, the way he listened to everything, with his full attention and without interruption, and when she finished he had simply said, "Keep it somewhere you won't lose it." She had moved it to the interior pocket of her winter coat after that, and there it had stayed through coat after coat over 5 decades, transferred automatically each season without conscious thought, the way you carry certain things not because you remember why, but because some part of you understands that the carrying itself matters. She opened the Bible. The pages were brittle and deeply yellowed, the thin paper carrying the particular fragility of something that had dried out over many decades and now existed in a state of careful suspension between preservation and disintegration. The text was a small, dense print that Loretta's eyes could not have managed without her glasses. She turned the pages slowly, working from the front, not entirely sure what she was looking for, and trusting that she would recognize it when she found it. She found it in the Book of Ruth. It was not hidden deeply or elaborately. There was no wax seal, no complicated concealment. Harriet had simply folded the document carefully and tucked it between the pages of Ruth and 1 Samuel, where it had rested undisturbed for what Loretta would later calculate was at least 40 years. The paper was stiff and dry, folded into quarters, its edges crisp where they had been creased and held in place by the pressure of the surrounding pages. Loretta unfolded it with careful fingers, smoothing each crease gently against her knee. It was a property deed. She read it slowly, twice, making certain she was understanding it correctly. The legal language was dense and formal in the style of an earlier era, but the essential facts were plain enough. The deed was dated March 14, 1962. It recorded the transfer of a specific parcel of land, 11 acres in Hargrave Falls, Georgia, along the Calder Creek corridor, to Harriet Louise Cowell, in full and without encumbrance. Signed by the transferring party, witnessed and notarized, entirely legitimate on its face. Loretta sat very still for a long moment, the deed held carefully in both hands, her mind working through the implications with the slow, methodical attention of someone who has learned through long experience not to react to important things before fully understanding them. She knew that land. She knew exactly where the Calder Creek corridor ran through Hargrave Falls. She knew it because everyone in Hargrave Falls knew it. It had been the subject of contentious local discussion for the past 3 years, ever since Reginald Sutton, the county land commissioner, had announced a major commercial development project on a stretch of land along Calder Creek that he claimed was unencumbered county property. The project was substantial and controversial, a mixed-use development that would bring significant money into Hargrave Falls, but would also permanently alter the character of one of the last genuinely undeveloped natural corridors in the county. The announcement had made Reginald Sutton very popular with certain people and very unpopular with others. It had also, Loretta now understood with a cold clarity that moved through her like creek water in January, been built entirely on a foundation that had a significant problem. Reginald Sutton was developing land he did not own, because according to the deed currently resting in Loretta Vane's hands, 11 acres of the Calder Creek corridor had belonged to Harriet Cowell since 1962, which meant it had passed, through the family trust, to Harriet's descendants, which meant it belonged to Loretta. Loretta did not sleep well that first night in Harriet's stone room. She had made herself as comfortable as the circumstances allowed. An old wool blanket from her suitcase spread across the bare chair frame. Her coat pulled tight, a small battery-powered lantern she had packed with the practical foresight of a woman who had learned never to assume things would go smoothly. And she lay in the dim quiet of the old stone walls, listening to the wind in the sweet gum trees and thinking with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who understood that what she did next would determine everything. The deed was real. She was certain of that much. The paper, the notarization, the signatures, everything about it had the authentic weight of a legitimate legal document. But Loretta was also 79 years old and had lived long enough to understand that being right and being believed were two entirely different conditions, and that the distance between them was often measured in power rather than truth. Reginald Sutton was the county land commissioner. He had held that position for 16 years. He was well-connected, well-funded, and publicly respected in the particular way of men who had spent decades carefully cultivating the appearance of competence and integrity. He had announced his Calder Creek development at a county gala attended by local business leaders, elected officials, and the regional press. He had accepted congratulations and shaken hands and smiled for photographs. He was not going to quietly concede an 11-acre problem to a 79-year-old widow living in an abandoned stone room because she had produced a 60-year-old deed from her grandmother's Bible. Loretta had no illusions about that. The first thing he would do, if she approached him directly and privately, was question the document's validity, consult his own lawyers, and use whatever time that process consumed to consolidate his position. The second thing he would do was make her feel small and confused and unreasonable for raising the issue at all. She had met men like Reginald Sutton many times over 79 years. She knew exactly how they operated when cornered privately versus when cornered publicly, which meant she could not corner him privately. Loretta thought about Harriet, who had spent her entire life in Hargrave Falls and had understood its rhythms and gathering places and social architecture the way you only understand a place you have inhabited for decades. Harriet had been a woman of deep practical intelligence, not educated in any formal sense, but possessed of the kind of clear-eyed understanding of human nature that no formal education could manufacture. She had known when to speak and when to wait, when to push and when to let things develop at their own pace. She had taught Loretta, through example rather than instruction, that the most effective kind of truth was not the kind delivered in private, where it could be managed and contained, but the kind delivered in public where it had to be faced directly and immediately. There was a county public meeting scheduled for Thursday evening. Loretta knew this because she had attended the previous two, sitting quietly in the back of the Hargrave Falls Municipal Hall while Reginald Sutton presented his Calder Creek development plans to assembled residents and accepted their questions with the polished patience of a man entirely confident in his position. She had attended because something about the project had troubled her in a way she could not entirely articulate. A vague unease about the land itself, a sense that something was not quite right that she had been unable to substantiate and had eventually set aside. She understood now what her instincts had been telling her. Thursday was 2 days away. That gave her 2 days to prepare, and preparation was something Loretta Vane understood deeply. She had spent 40 years as a seamstress, work that demanded precision and patience and the ability to see exactly what a finished thing needed to look like before a single stitch was placed. She approached the next 48 hours with the same disciplined focus, moving through each necessary step with deliberate care. The first thing she needed was to look like someone whose words carried weight. This was not vanity, it was strategy. She had seen enough of the world to know that the same truth delivered by a woman who looked defeated and the same truth delivered by a woman who looked composed and certain were received entirely differently by an audience. She had one good dress in her suitcase, a deep navy wool she had made herself 3 years ago and had packed almost without thinking, as though some quiet part of her had understood it would be needed. She pressed it carefully using the small travel iron she kept from long habit, smoothed every crease with the expert hands of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for fabric. The second thing she needed was documentation. The deed alone was powerful, but power needed architecture. She spent Tuesday evening writing careful notes in her small, precise handwriting, a timeline, a clear summary of the deed's contents, a list of every relevant fact she could establish. She wrote slowly and methodically, checking each detail against the deed itself, building the kind of orderly, irrefutable record that left no room for confusion or dismissal. By Wednesday night, Loretta was ready. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of Georgia autumn day that reminded you winter was serious about coming. Loretta woke early in the stone room, folded her blanket with the neat precision of long habit, and sat quietly for a few minutes in the pale light filtering through the old door frame. She had slept better the second night than the first, which surprised her until she realized it shouldn't. The first night, she had been processing shock and grief and the accumulated weight of everything that had happened on Willowmere Drive. The second night, she had been a woman with a plan, and plans, in Loretta's experience, were the most reliable antidote to sleeplessness that existed. She dressed carefully, taking her time with each detail the way she had always taken time with work that mattered. The navy wool dress fit her well, as her own clothes always did. She had the advantage of knowing her measurements precisely and the skill to use that knowledge. She pinned her silver hair neatly, applied the small amount of makeup she kept from long habit, and examined herself in the compact mirror she had packed in her suitcase. What looked back at her was not a defeated woman, not a homeless woman, not a woman who had been laughed at by her own children 2 days ago on a concrete driveway while strangers carried away her ceramic lamp. What looked back at her was someone composed, deliberate, and entirely certain of her purpose. She arrived in Hargrave Falls 2 hours before the meeting, walking the 7 miles at her steady pace, arriving in town at 5 in the afternoon with enough time to do one important thing before the municipal hall opened its doors. She went to the county records office on Clement Street, which closed at 5:30, and asked the young clerk at the front desk for access to the historical property records for the Calder Creek corridor parcels currently identified in Reginald Sutton's development filings. The clerk, a young woman named Wilda Peck, who wore her hair in a practical braid and had the alert, quietly observant manner of someone who paid attention to more than her job description required, pulled the records without comment and set them on the counter. Loretta examined them carefully for 20 minutes, comparing the parcel boundaries in Sutton's development documentation against the description in Harriet's deed with the focused precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was looking at. The overlap was unambiguous. 7 of the 11 acres described in Harriet's 1962 deed fell directly within the boundaries of the parcels Reginald Sutton had filed as unencumbered county property in his development application. Not adjacent to them, not approximately near them, directly within them. Either Sutton's team had conducted a title search so inadequate it bordered on negligence, or they had conducted a thorough one and chosen to proceed regardless. Loretta did not know which of those possibilities was true. She knew only that the result was identical either way. Wilda Peck, who had been quietly reorganizing files at the far end of the counter and had therefore been present for the entirety of Loretta's examination, looked up when Loretta carefully closed the records folder and straightened her posture. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them that required no words. The particular recognition of a younger woman watching an older one demonstrate a quality that transcends age entirely. "The meeting starts at 7, Wilda said simply. "Public comment period is the last 30 minutes. They always underestimate how many people want to speak, so they usually run long." Loretta thanked her quietly and left the records office with the deed folded in the interior pocket of her coat and her notes in the small cloth bag she carried over one wrist. She ate a modest dinner at a counter seat in a diner on Hargrave's Main Street, sitting quietly among the evening regulars, drawing no particular attention. A 79-year-old woman eating soup alone was not a remarkable sight in any town. Nobody who glanced at her over their coffee would have guessed she was preparing to walk into the municipal hall in 90 minutes and dismantle something a powerful man had spent 3 years constructing. At 6:55, Loretta entered the Hargrave Falls Municipal Hall. The room was fuller than she had expected. Perhaps 60 people arranged in rows of folding chairs, the low hum of pre-meeting conversation filling the space with a warmth that the fluorescent overhead lighting did nothing to support. At the front of the room, Behind a long table arranged on a low platform sat 3 county officials. In the center, leaning back in a chair with the relaxed authority of a man entirely at home in his own domain, was Reginald Sutton. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 2 decades being the most important person in every room he entered. He was laughing at something the official to his left had said, his posture open and expansive, radiating the particular confidence of a man who had no reason whatsoever to expect this evening to be anything other than routine. Loretta found a seat in the 3rd row, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The meeting proceeded through its scheduled business with the unhurried pace of local government confident in its own authority. Zoning updates, road maintenance approvals, a brief discussion about the proposed renovation of the town's public library. Loretta sat in the 3rd row through all of it, her hands folded, her posture straight, her expression composed. Several people around her shifted and whispered and checked their phones. Loretta did none of those things. She had waited 50 years for the truth her grandmother had left her. She could wait another 40 minutes. Reginald Sutton presented his Calder Creek development update with the polished fluency of someone who had delivered the same material many times and had refined it down to its most persuasive form. New investment coming into Hargrave Falls. Jobs created. Tax revenue generated. A thoughtful, responsible development that honored the natural character of the corridor while creating lasting value for the community. He used the word community 4 times in 8 minutes. He smiled frequently, made deliberate eye contact with people he recognized in the audience, and projected throughout the air of a man generously sharing good news rather than advancing his own considerable financial interests. There was applause when he finished. Not universal, but substantial. The public comment period opened at 8:15. A man in the 2nd row spoke first, raising concerns about traffic impact. A woman toward the back asked about environmental assessments for the creek itself. 2 more speakers followed with questions about construction timelines and noise ordinances. Sutton answered each one with patient, practiced smoothness, his manner suggesting that all concerns were understandable but ultimately unnecessary given the thoroughness of the planning already completed. Then Loretta stood up. She did not raise her hand dramatically or wait to be called upon with any particular ceremony. She simply stood, and something about the quality of her stillness as she rose, the unhurried composure of it, the absolute absence of nervousness, caused the room to quiet in a way that the previous speakers had not managed. "My name is Loretta Vane," she said clearly, her voice carrying to the back of the room without strain. "I have lived in Hargrave Falls for 53 years. I have a matter to raise regarding the Calder Creek development that I believe this room needs to hear." Sutton looked at her from behind his table with the professionally courteous expression he had applied to every speaker. Nothing in his face suggested recognition or concern. She was a well-dressed elderly woman he had never met, rising for public comment at a routine county meeting. He had no reason yet to feel anything other than mild, practiced patience. "Mr. Sutton has described the Calder Creek parcels as unencumbered county property," Loretta continued, reaching in her coat and producing the deed with steady hands. "I'm holding a recorded property deed dated March 14th, 1962, transferring 11 acres of the Calder Creek corridor, 7 of which fall directly within the boundaries of this development project, to my grandmother, Harriet Louise Cowell. The deed is notarized, properly witnessed, and entirely legitimate. I confirmed this afternoon at the county records office that no subsequent transfer of this property has ever been recorded." The room changed immediately. Not loudly. There was no single dramatic outburst. It was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, a collective adjustment as 60 people simultaneously recalibrated their understanding of what kind of meeting they were attending. Sutton's expression did not collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something moved behind his eyes, a rapid, involuntary calculation that lasted no more than a fraction of a second before his professional composure reasserted itself. "Mrs. Vane," he said, his voice measured and carefully warm, "I appreciate you raising this concern. Property records from that era can sometimes be difficult to interpret accurately, and I'd be happy to have our legal team review whatever document you have to ensure. The document is straightforward, Loretta said, without raising her voice or altering her pace. I have spent 40 years doing precise, detailed work as a seamstress. I know how to read a legal description. I also spent 20 minutes this afternoon comparing this deed against your own development filings in the county records office. The overlap is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of boundaries, and the boundaries are unambiguous. She looked around the room deliberately, meeting the eyes of the people watching her, giving them a moment to understand what they were witnessing. I'm not here to cause disruption. I am here because a piece of land that has belonged to my family since 1962 is currently being developed by someone who either did not know it wasn't his to develop or knew and proceeded regardless. Either of those possibilities seems like something this community deserves to understand clearly before construction begins. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realizes that the evening they thought they were attending has become something else entirely. Reginald Sutton set down his pen with a care that suggested his hands needed something deliberate to do. His face had gone carefully still in the way of men who have just understood that the ground beneath them is not as solid as they believed. The room erupted the moment Sutton set down his pen. Not violently, not with the chaotic energy of a crowd losing its composure, but with the urgent, overlapping energy of 60 people who had just been handed significant new information and had immediate, pressing opinions about it. Voices rose from every section of the folding chairs. Questions directed at Sutton, questions directed at the other officials at the table, conversations breaking out sideways between neighbors who had come expecting routine and were now witnessing something considerably more consequential. Sutton raised both hands in a calming gesture and spoke over the noise with the amplified authority of the microphone in front of him. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure everyone in this room that we take property matters with complete seriousness, and we will absolutely conduct a thorough review of whatever documentation has been presented this evening. His voice was steady, professionally reassuring, doing the work he had trained it to do over 16 years of public life. These situations occasionally arise with older records, and they are always resolvable through proper legal process. I want to be clear that this development project has undergone extensive due diligence. Then how did you miss a recorded deed? The question came from the middle of the room, a man's voice, direct and without hostility, but entirely without deference. Sutton paused for precisely 1 second too long before answering. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but Loretta saw several people around her register it. Title searches are complex processes, he said carefully. Older documents are not always indexed in ways that make them readily accessible through standard search procedures. The document was recorded, Loretta said from where she still stood, her voice calm and even. It has a recording number. It is in the county records. I found the relevant files in 20 minutes this afternoon using nothing more than the public access counter at the records office on Clement Street. Another wave of murmuring moved through the room. Sutton looked at her, and for just a moment the professional warmth in his expression thinned enough to reveal something colder and more calculated underneath. Then the warmth returned, applied with slightly more visible effort than before. Mrs. Vane, I think the most productive path forward is to have both parties represented by legal counsel and work through the proper channels to establish. I agree entirely about legal counsel, Loretta said. I intend to retain an attorney beginning tomorrow morning. I am raising this publicly tonight because this community has been presented with a development plan built on a factual foundation that has a significant problem, and I believe the people in this room have a right to know that before any further approvals are granted or any ground is broken. She reached into her cloth bag and produced the careful notes she had written over the preceding 2 days, the timeline, the summary, the documented comparison of boundaries. She held them up so the room could see that she was not operating on memory or impression, but on prepared, organized documentation. I have a written summary of the relevant facts, if anyone would like to examine it. I also have photographs of the original deed document, which I am prepared to share. Wilda Peck, sitting in the back row where Loretta had not noticed her until this moment, stood up quietly. "I work in the county records office," she said to the room, her voice steady and clear. "I was present this afternoon when Mrs. Vane reviewed the historical property records. The deed she is referencing exists in the county records. The parcel boundaries she has described are consistent with what I observed in the documentation. The effect of a county records employee providing unsolicited corroboration in a public meeting was immediate and visible. Something shifted definitively in the room's collective posture, a turning, a reorientation, 60 people simultaneously adjusting their assessment of who in this room was standing on solid ground. Sutton's face underwent a change that Loretta had been waiting for and recognized instantly when it came. Not a collapse, not a confession, but the particular settling that happens when a man accustomed to controlling situations understands that this one has moved beyond his control. His shoulders dropped a fraction. The microphone hand flattened against the table. The professional warmth in his expression did not disappear, but became mechanical, a habit continuing past the point where it was doing any useful work. One of the other officials at the table leaned toward him and said something low and urgent. Sutton listened, nodded once, and looked back at the room with an expression that had traded its earlier expansiveness for something careful and contained. "In light of this evening's information," he said slowly, "I am recommending that the county place an immediate voluntary hold on all Calder Creek development proceedings pending a full and independent title review. We will retain outside counsel and conduct a comprehensive examination of all relevant property records." He paused. "This project will not move forward until every question about the underlying title has been fully and transparently resolved." Loretta sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and allowed herself, privately and without any outward display, one long and complete breath of relief. The aftermath moved faster than Loretta had anticipated, which was itself a lesson she filed quietly away. That truth, once released into the open air after long confinement, tends to travel at its own considerable pace regardless of what anyone prefers. By Friday morning, a local reporter from the Hargrave Falls Gazette had left 3 messages on Loretta's phone. By Friday afternoon, a regional news outlet had picked up the story. By Saturday, it had traveled further still, carried along by the particular current that stories about elderly women standing up alone against institutional power tend to generate in an era when people are hungry for evidence that such things are still possible. The headline the Gazette ran was simple and effective. "Widow finds grandmother's deed, halts major county development," and it was shared widely enough that by Sunday Loretta had heard from 2 different people that it had appeared in their social media feeds before they had even known it concerned someone from Hargrave Falls. Solomon Greer called her on Friday morning. He was a property attorney based in Augusta who had read the initial report and offered his services on a contingency basis, explaining that the case was straightforward enough on its face that he was confident proceeding without an upfront retainer. Loretta met him at a coffee shop on Clement Street, sat across from him with the deed and her written notes spread on the table between them, and watched him read through everything with the focused attention of a man who already knew what he was looking at. "This is clean," he said when he had finished. "The recording is legitimate, the description is precise, and the chain of title from your grandmother through the family trust to you is traceable." Sutton's team either missed this entirely or made a decision to proceed in the hope it would never surface. He looked at her directly. "Either way, the land is yours." The independent title review that Reginald Sutton had announced at Thursday's meeting confirmed Solomon Greer's assessment within 3 weeks. 7 of Harriet's 11 acres fell squarely within the development boundaries. The county's outside counsel delivered their findings in a written report that was, by the clipped and careful standards of legal language, damning. The title search conducted by Sutton's development team had been inadequate, the oversight significant, and the county's exposure to legal liability substantial. Reginald Sutton resigned as county land commissioner on a Tuesday morning, releasing a brief statement through his personal attorney that cited a desire to spend more time with his family. Nobody in Hargrave Falls appeared to find the timing coincidental. The development project was suspended indefinitely. A civil claim was filed on Loretta's behalf seeking compensation for damages related to the planned use of her property without authorization. The settlement reached 6 weeks later was not extravagant. Loretta had not asked Solomon to pursue maximum damages, had told him specifically that she wanted fair resolution rather than prolonged conflict. But it was sufficient. Enough to purchase a small house on the eastern side of Hargrave Falls outright. Enough to live without financial anxiety for the remainder of her life. Enough to feel, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely secure. She chose a house with a garden and good light, the same practical priorities Harriet had always applied to questions of where to put down roots. She planted lavender along the front path deliberately, in quiet acknowledgement of the woman who had preserved a truth for 50 years and trusted her granddaughter to find it when it was finally needed. Her children came to her 3 weeks after the Thursday meeting, all 3 of them together, visibly chastened in a way that Loretta suspected had as much to do with the regional news coverage as with genuine reckoning. She let them in, made coffee, and listened to what they had to say without interrupting. Brendan spoke first, haltingly and without his usual authority. Corinne cried genuinely, which Loretta noted. Alton said very little, but sat with his hands clasped and his eyes on the floor in a manner that communicated more than his words might have. When they had finished, Loretta set down her cup and looked at each of them in turn. "I raised you," she said simply. "I gave you everything I had without reservation and without keeping score. When I needed you, you chose convenience over me. I want you to understand that clearly, not as an accusation, but as a fact that I am asking you to carry honestly going forward." She paused. "I'm not closing the door. But trust is rebuilt through consistent action over time, not through guilt and not through one conversation." Alton nodded, and his eyes were wet. On a bright November morning 6 weeks after she had walked away from Willowmere Drive with a single suitcase and 50 years of deferred faith in her grandmother's dying words, Loretta Vane stood in her own garden in the thin winter sunlight and planted the last of her lavender. The deed was framed on her living room wall. The Bible sat on her side table, open to the Book of Ruth. She had lost everything at 79, and everything had come back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.